Hi, everyone. Welcome. Yay! Yes, that's yeah. Um, I don't know if it's good evening, good afternoon. It's somewhere in between, which is I think it's nice. I'm Andrea Avidad, the Public Humanities Fellow at Espacio de Culturas, and a PhD candidate in Cinema Studies at TESH. So I'm very happy that we are screening a documentary by Dr. Penelope Anthias called Urukurenda, In Search of the Land Without Evil, as part of the public programs organized this semester by our chair in Latin American Cultures and Civilization, Dr. Enrique Okenve. Urukurenda is a documentary that allows us to witness the reality-based community of indigenous peoples in Bolivia who continue to fight for the recognition of legal personhood in the face of a state that continues to administer their lives as something basically disposable. Against such a legal system whose understanding of subjecthood is willfully blind to indigenous existence, whose logic is one of extractivism and which is still haunted by the spectral legacy of colonialism, the documentary audiovisual texture allows us to take time to see faces and hear the testimonies of indigenous peoples who continue to organize, to be recognized and subjects. This documentary truly sees them and allows us to see them as subjects with rights to life, to land, and to a future. Anthias' documentary gives us an image of a community also founded in a practice of care. To exist as a community, to be a community, require practices of care between individuals, the land, and the environment. Urukurenda also provides these indigenous communities with a document containing evidence to support their own struggle for legal personhood. This is a documentary whose function is to serve as evidence in a legal battle, and as such, it has a performative force, and performative in the sense that it has the capacity to perform an action, to provoke a result, or to intervene in the realities of these communities. Throughout this semester, Dr. Okenve has organized public programs that have offered us the opportunity to reflect on the complex historicity of indigenous identities, on the multiple significances of the very term indigenous, and on the many nuances of indigenous resistance across time and space. And without a doubt, this final public program closes an ambitious academic semester by reminding us that film still carries the power of resistance, that our modes of observing and understanding the realities of diverse communities are themselves ethical acts of perception. I hope that you enjoyed the film, and please stay for a post-screening discussion between Dr. Anthias, Dr. Okenve, and Gloria Tadii Ángeles Cruz, who will be discussing many interesting things. Thank you so much.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. I hope that you enjoy this film. Before I introduce our two guests for this evening, let me just tell you a little bit about the idea of behind organizing this. Andrea has mentioned before that, for the past few months, I've been involved in this project, like inquiring, investigating indigeneity across time and space. My family is originally from Equatorial Guinea. I'm a Fang person of the Zomo clan. And one of the things, for example, watching this film, I thought about the issues of mobility. One of the things, like in our case, we don't normally say where we're from. We say we're the child of somebody because our villages move, over time. And we were never really fixed into one particular place. So there are ways in which, by looking at this, it made me think about those connections. Obviously, the connections have also to do with the fact that Equatorial Guinea For those of you who don't know, it's in the Gulf of Guinea, in between Cameroon and Gabon. That is on the Atlantic coast of Africa. And Equatorial Guinea was a Spanish colony, and this is in a way basically what brings us or connects me and the experience of my ancestors with the experiences that we see here in one way or another, because all of this has this colonial legacy. Much longer in the case of the Americas, as you obviously know. In our case, was much shorter, but equally there are some connections. But anyway, for today, for this evening, the idea was to for our last event. I wanted to initially I was caught in two minds. I wanted to have like activists, indigenous activists, who will tell us about the legacies of colonialism and the sort of like forces that disempower indigenous peoples, indigenous communities across the different parts of the former Spanish Empire and so on. But I wanted to show that there is still a legacy very much present in ways that had been recreated, and at the same time there are ways in which like indigenous peoples are organizing to leave that legacy behind. So that was one idea, but at the same time I wanted us to bring some kind of like a different media, right? Because academics will write papers and stuff like that, and they're powerful in their own way, but when you want to describe, when you want to sort of portray these realities, I don't think it can compete with film, right? And this is why I can't remember how, but I came across Penelope's film and said, this is perfect. So and I said, I want us to have this film for our last event, but I still wanted to have a representative of indigenous activism. And well, talking to Paulina Pineda from here at NYU, she recommended Gloria. And here we are to talk about it. But before we do that, I want to introduce the two of them. So let me start with Penelope, who is Penelope Anthias, Dr. Penelope Anthias, who is the filmmaker, the person who has created this film. She is an associate professor in the Department of Geography at Durham University in northeastern England. Her research examines struggles around indigeneity, territory, and the politics of resource extraction in Latin America. Her work is grounded in a decade and a half of engaged ethnographic research in Bolivia's Chaco region. Her work is theoretically heterodox and interdisciplinary, drawing inspiration from anti-colonial, Marxist, and Foucaultian traditions to offer an empirically grounded account of how colonial relations are reproduced, contested at resource frontiers and in struggles over land and property, some of which we have obviously watched today. She has contributed to debates in political ecology, postcolonial geographies, legal geography, anthropology of development, and critical agrarian studies, among others. At the heart of her approach is a commitment to centering voices of indigenous peoples, and I think this film is a magnificent example of that, and other racialized rural populations, not only as sources of empirical knowledge, but as producers of geographical theory. This has led her to methodological experimentation, combining long-term ethnography with participatory methods, counter-mapping, and most recently, documentary filmmaking, as we have seen today. And as far as Gloria Tadii Ángeles Cruz, she's from an indigenous community in Oaxaca, Mexico. As a child, she emigrated to Mexico City, where she completed middle school. She has been involved in activism for her entire life because as a child, she learned about the problems that indigenous communities face, especially in her region. In 2016, Gloria founded Radio Rebeldía, La Voz Migrante de Nueva York, a community radio project which is currently on pause due to lack of funds. She has also focused her efforts on women's rights and the growing epidemic of violence and feminicide in Mexico and beyond. In 2020, she was spokesperson for the Council of Indigenous Peoples in New York City, and currently she is working with the Molino Informativo project based in the Bronx, New York, where she creates journalism. She tells the story of her fellow indigenous migrants who built the city, and also she works among the skyscrapers of the city. All right, so welcome to the two of you. Thank you so much for accepting the invitation. I have to say that the different people, I invited several people over the last few months. All of them told me yes, so you don't always get a yes in these kinds of situations, so I'm most grateful that you accepted the invitation to join us here today. So before we sort of like address some of the topics here in this film, I'd like to speak to Penelope a little bit about background of this film, because talking the couple of conversations that we had, you told me that this came a little bit to you as I don't know if as a surprise, but in a way, like basically this is the project that came to you, that you got involved. I don't know if you can tell us a little bit more about how this project started, the project behind this film, and what was expected to achieve with this film.
Thank you. Well, just first of all, just want to thank everyone for coming, and to Enrique for the invitation, and to everyone who's made this visit possible. It's a real privilege to be here and to have the opportunity to share this story with you all. So this is the second documentary film that I've made as part of a project that I've been doing since about 2019, looking at new gas extraction in a protected area, which, as you'll have seen in the film, is called the Tariquia National Reserve of Flora and Fauna in the southeast of Bolivia. So there's two questions maybe, is how I got into film as a way of kind of working with these communities, and kind of how this particular film came about. So I've been working in this region of Bolivia since about 2008, primarily with the Guarani people, but also more recently with communities who identify as comunidades campesinas. And for me, documentary film has been a way that I can start to move away from traditional academic research methods and forms of knowledge production, which are really kind of extracting knowledge from communities, often to produce texts for external audiences. And so I wanted to find ways that I could kind of co-produce knowledge with communities, and see my role not as an author, but more as a kind of convener of people sharing their own knowledge. And to do that in a way that allowed me to give something back to communities who were involved in my research. So the films, they are quite interview-based, as you've seen, and that's because they are part of a kind of research process. But I've tried to kind of make these films in a relatively short amount of time with a relatively limited budget, to be able to share something with communities during the research process, and also then to have knowledge that can be shared locally and actually contribute something to these ongoing struggles, which are, as you can see, partly struggles for visibility, partly struggles to contest kind of colonial forms of erasure, non-recognition. And the kind of invitation to make the film with Urukurenda actually came from my long-standing relationship with the Guarani People's Assembly, the Asamblea del Pueblo Guarani. In fact, the communities I'd been working with for this project in the protected area were primarily not indigenous communities, but when I learned that there was a community, a Guarani community at the kind of southern edge of this national park that was struggling for legal recognition, I was really interested to kind of tell that story. And there was also an interest from the community themselves in having me learn their struggle and actually kind of document their history. So initially, the kind of invitation came via a lawyer who's a good friend of mine for many years, who's worked with the Guarani organization. Initially, the invitation was to produce some kind of document that kind of told the struggle. But because I began working with film, and I started thinking about the kind of the the role of orality and what I could do with film. And so I actually proposed to the community that instead of me writing a document, that we could actually record a film. And there was, it's not a community that I've worked with for long, so I had some reservations about kind of making this film with a community that was relatively new to me. But the reason I decided to do that was really because there was a strong interest in me being able to kind of find a way of telling the story. All
right. Yeah. In that story that you tell, I mean, in this idea of knowledge production, I assume that the community has watched the film. So I have two questions in one. Is just what do they expect to do with the film, and also how they receive the film, like after watching the whole production. What was the impression on it?
So as part of the kind of process, I shared a kind of draft version of the community with all of the participants to get their feedback and their consent. Essentially, they were kind of happy with the way that I'd put together the story. Particularly the community's current leader, Maximiliano Queso, was extremely happy with the film. So it kind of went on to be used as part of a kind of legal complaint that's part of a long series of kind of back and forth between the departmental state, the Gobernación in Tarija, and this community, and essentially they're disputing the process of kind of non-recognition, the denial or the revocation of their legal personhood. And so it kind of was used as a legal document in that case. As was pretty much expected, that was not successful at the first hurdle, which was the departmental court. It then was kind of sent to the kind of national constitutional court in Sucre, and this legal process is ongoing. So we've been told that it could take some time to come to fruition. So there are no guarantees in this kind of process that legal change is going to happen because of the documentary. But I think this is something we thought about in the process, and we decided that regardless of the legal outcome, there's still a purpose in creating the documentary.
Yeah. And just finally about it, I mean, one impression that I think I told you the first time I watched it, I was surprised that you don't see, despite all the frustration and this is a long-standing battle, you don't see bitterness, right? I mean, I don't know, maybe because I've been living in Jamaica for a while now, and let me tell you, it will be very different, the reaction of people to this kind of situation, especially when they know the law is on their side, and yet, they don't get what they are entitled to, right? Legally, and I was a little bit, I don't know if surprised is the right word, but I mean, I found it unusual. But I mean, I don't know, if that was something that you also, this is just the recordings, or this is something that you generally observe in the process of creating this film with them.
Yeah, that's an interesting observation. I mean, I think there's certainly frustration, but I think indigenous peoples in this region, they are very used to, having to struggle for a long time. I think often it's outsiders who kind of either become extremely unrealistically optimistic or completely disillusioned. And I think there's a patience and there's an endurance to the Guarani struggle that comes from a long history of confronting these kind of colonial power structures. I think the other thing is perhaps that making the documentary was a kind of very affirming, it was an opportunity to have their story told in a context where they were being told they didn't exist. And so perhaps, some of the participants, like Dino Ortiz, is kind of, older. He's got some health complications, and I think there was a real appreciation of the opportunity to tell the story, which is not the same as state recognition, infrastructure, and all of that. But in a way, perhaps storytelling provides its own dimension of recognition, particularly when that story can then be shared with other kind of local actors.
Yes, thank you. So, Gloria, by the way, Gloria is going to speak in Spanish. I don't know if anybody, I think maybe what we can do is like provide a little bit of a summary in English after she speaks, right? But she feels more comfortable speaking in Spanish. So, and I'm also going to ask her in Spanish, so it's easier also. Gloria, una de las cosas, bueno, te he visto que estabas asintiendo, ¿no? Cuando hablaba a Penelope sobre esta última pregunta. So, en ese caso, también habíamos hablado tú y yo antes y me dijiste que veías, a pesar de la distancia, ¿no? Y veías algunas similitudes, ¿no? Con la experiencia de tu comunidad y no sé si nos puedes decir un poco esas impresiones desde la perspectiva de bueno, pues es una experiencia de pueblos indígenas en México, miles de kilómetros del sur de Bolivia. ¿Qué es lo que te sugirió esta película?
Dios de invitación. Muchas gracias por la invitación. Son palabras en mi lengua cuicateca. Y bueno, ver el documental, porque ya lo había visto, para mí es algo familiar, ya que desde mi punto de vista o desde lo que veo en mi comunidad, vivimos situaciones muy similares, sobre todo al final, donde ellos están defendiendo el territorio de estas compañías. En México y especialmente Oaxaca, hasta el año 2017, teníamos 2.800 proyectos concesionados a empresas extranjeras que pues han destruido el tejido social, y algunas comunidades como la mía siguen resistiendo. Nosotros desde fuera, porque en realidad la comunidad, no sé cómo decirlo, se ha dejado comprar por las compañías, pero nosotros que estamos fuera nos hemos organizado desde las diferentes geografías donde nos encontramos y estamos luchando para que, en el caso de mi pueblo, que se llama Tepeucila, la minera no comience, no ha comenzado a trabajar. Entonces creo que la lucha de los guaraníes y de los quechuas es muy similar a la de nosotros allá en México, particularmente en mi comunidad.
All right, so Gloria is saying that basically this is a familiar story. By the way, if I don't need to translate, just tell me. No, you don't need to translate. But I mean, just in case, if there's anybody who needs assistance with translation. But very quickly, Gloria says that this is a familiar story, like from the perspective of her community, Cuicatec community in Oaxaca, Mexico. Because she's familiar with the story of like organizing themselves to fight against the advance of foreign companies, mining companies in particular, that had been, I think you say 2,800? Oh.
Yeah, since 2017, we already have 2,800 projects.
Yeah. So that there had been basically like companies have been granted license to operate in the area, and this is having all sort of like disruptive effects on local communities. And in some cases, it's happening, she says, with the complicity of individuals, which I think, by the way, is quite important, because I mean, just because they are indigenous communities, indigenous peoples, doesn't mean that they're not individuals as well. So I think it's important to point out that there are different interests at stake here. But she says that there is the hope, and that she saw, I mean, also the thing that she saw in the film that is familiar is the ways in which, like, in her community, just like the Guarani and Quechua communities organize themselves, which is something that perhaps we can also talk about, because you talk about Penelope. You talk about in the film, or no, in the film. Just a while ago, you mentioned about this process of knowledge creation as a collective process that involves not just you, but obviously the people that you interviewing and consulting and so on. So one of the things that I thought was very interesting in the film is the ways in which like you see this knowledge being shared, right? Like the community of Urukurenda didn't really have much experience, but they were able to gain experience from the experience of other communities and so on. So I think I'm asking the two of you to maybe tell us a little bit from your different experiences how this knowledge, right, is shared, because there is a lot of like skill in the ways in which like they see how they manipulate and or taking advantage of existing legislation in order to obviously advance their interests and their positions, but this is very much knowledge that is shared between different communities and so on. So I wonder if the two of you podéis hablar un poco más sobre cómo se comparte este conocimiento de una comunidad a otra.
Bueno, en el caso de nosotros los cuicatecos, particularmente yo comencé como en los años 90, estaba muy pequeña, creo que tenía como unos 15 años cuando comencé a trabajar en la comunidad, pero yo ya estaba afuera, yo vivía en Ciudad de México, y algunas comunidades se organizaron. Después del Tratado de Libre Comercio, pues obviamente llegaron todas estas compañías y muchas comunidades se organizaron, excepto la mía. La mía sí dejó, o sea, como se dejó comprar pues por las empresas. Pero nosotros los que ya habíamos migrado a Ciudad de México, decidimos organizarnos desde fuera y comenzar a defender el territorio. Entonces, y comenzamos también a buscar otras comunidades de la región y desde el 2001 hicimos un primer congreso regional donde informamos de lo que estaba pasando en la comunidad, pero los que estábamos fuera ya organizados fuimos expulsados prácticamente de nuestra propia comunidad porque hay intereses económicos. Entonces, pues viendo el documental, se conecta mucho con lo que pasa no solo en Bolivia, sino creo que en toda Latinoamérica. Si empezamos a buscar, pues casi todas las comunidades están sufriendo, pero al mismo tiempo también se están organizando.
Should I add
Sure.
that?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, so I mean, I think these processes of sharing knowledge between communities are so important, and often they're not kind of visible or documented. And I think there's kind of two examples in the film is, well, firstly, the way in which Urukurenda, when they were first kind of trying to found a new community, they sought experience from Guarani communities who were already organizing in other parts of the Chaco. And this was in the 1990s, a real era of kind of indigenous resurgence in Bolivia, and particularly the Guarani, having lived under a system, a really exploitative system of debt peonage, began to organize capitanías, captaincies, occupy land. And the way that happened and the way that spread through the Chaco was actually through community members walking on foot across the countryside to spread the word about we are forming a new organization. So this was a kind of a grassroots agrarian revolution, really, in Bolivia, even if it happened with reference to international kind of legal frameworks for indigenous rights. And those, I mean, I've been working with the Guarani now for about 16, 17 years, and even I was surprised to hear the story of Urukurenda, because they're an example of people who were left out of those indigenous territorial claims that were created in the 1990s, one of which is Itikawasu. And so they were kind of trying to gain knowledge of those processes, actually with a hope of gaining territorial recognition themselves. The second context in which these these forms of kind of sharing knowledge are really important is precisely in struggles against oil companies. What's happening in Tarikia is very much resonant with what you said about oil companies arriving with lots of promises, trying to divide communities, trying to convince people. And actually, the first film that I made in this national park is with a group of kind of a women-led defense committee, Comité de Defensa, which is in another part of the same of the Tarikia Reserve.
It's don't touch Tarikia.
Don't
right?
touch Tarikia. And
film.
one of the things that's really interesting in that case is that in order to understand better what does gas development really mean? What are the long-term consequences? Is it going to be like the oil companies are promising? What these communities did is they actually went to visit Guarani communities in the Chaco who have been living with gas development since the 1990s. They went to see the contamination. They went to talk with community members. They recorded on their phones and they returned to their communities and they shared those stories. And this has ended up being probably the most significant recent case of community resistance to gas extraction in Bolivia, with very long blockades against the entry of oil companies. And this was made possible by processes of sharing knowledge between communities who are already facing the consequences of extraction and those who are recently kind of seeing a new hydrocarbon frontier.
Yeah, and you mentioned, well, the two of you actually mentioned the 1990s, right? It seems like there is like the root of many of the recent problems or many of the challenges that we're facing today, and I think is very interesting because also Gloria mentioned too el Tratado de Libre Comercio. I think it's NAFTA, like how it's known here, right? So so the 1990s, and one of the things I was talking to my family this morning, what's happening and all of that. And one of the things I can't remember, I think it has something to do with a recent visit of the Pope to Africa. He actually came to Equatorial Guinea, and apparently he spoke something about in relation to these leaders who accumulate so much wealth and stuff like that. I guess he was, without mentioning any names or calling any names, he was probably thinking about the president of Equatorial Guinea and his son. But anyway, one of the things I told my family is that, well, I guess it is his experience in Latin America. And one of the things I told them, like, what I've been learning over the last few months is this long history, right? And how is the accumulation of this knowledge and these experiences over centuries. And then I said and then since independence, we're talking about almost 200 years, right? It's just like, then you have 200 years of continued experience and so on. And so I said, like, well, they clearly have all this accumulated experience of so many centuries, so they are way ahead of us in terms of organizing themselves and mobilizing themselves and so on. I only told them I hope it doesn't take us 200 years to get it for us to get us organized. But anyway, I think my question, and I don't know if the two of you can answer this question, because I'm a historian, so I'm always interested in how these things are happening over the long term. So in a sense, basically, the 1990s is a key moment in terms of the revival in this kind of indigenous activism and indigenous rights and so on. And in a way, my question as a historian is that what was happening before? Because what you see in the 1990s is indigenous communities, indigenous activists taking advantage of all this knowledge. And I'm always interested in how was this knowledge and these experiences were transmitted and shared at the time when we were not paying attention to all these things. So, Gloria, creo que es algo de lo que te pregunté antes. No creo que no necesitas que lo traduzcan, ¿no? Pero las dos, quizá, maybe the two of you, podéis decir algo. Si tenéis alguna idea de fuera de estos momentos de más como militancia, cómo se transmitía este conocimiento y experiencias.
Bueno, en el caso de mi comunidad, pues no siempre ha sido tan visible o la política no siempre ha sido tan visible, pero creo que las formas de organización siempre han estado presentes, solo que en los años 90 nadie decía hacen activismo y tampoco decían defender el territorio, como que son palabras más recientes, pero nosotros nos habíamos organizado, perdón, no nos habíamos, no sé, yo me integré porque ya había un grupo desde, no sé, desde los años 80 que estaban haciendo algunas cosas pues en la región, solo que cuando llega el Tratado de Libre Comercio, pues muchas cosas cambian. Esto estamos hablando del año 94 y es casi cuando yo comienzo a trabajar. Entonces, pues desde mi experiencia, las cosas comenzaron a cambiar, pero no para bien. No para bien porque tal vez la pobreza hizo que se rompiera el tejido social. Entonces, nosotros, por ejemplo, que ya estábamos en Ciudad de México, pues comenzamos a organizar y creo que ni siquiera nosotros mismos llamábamos, ay, somos activistas, no, solo estábamos tratando de defender nuestro territorio contra estas mineras, y el conocimiento y la memoria de los abuelos que nos habían enseñado cómo organizarnos, y era el momento de comenzar a a poner en práctica toda la herencia y el conocimiento de nuestros abuelos, que había sido transmitido desde la lengua propia.
Okay, just briefly before Penelope shares her thoughts on this. So basically, there were different forms. There always existed different forms in which, like, their communities organize themselves. It's only that the main difference is in those days, the word activism wasn't a word that was used, and let alone the term defensa del territorio, like how you translate it, defensa, like defense of the territorial defense, right? But yeah, there were many of the issues that they are spoken about today, or since the 1990s with activism and so on. People were already speaking about some of these issues before. It's only that the 1990s created conditions worsen in the 1990s with NAFTA. And one of the main impacts that they noticed is this this disintegration of the social fabric, which perhaps was I guess I interpret like a great threat to the survival of the communities, and perhaps that explains also why. But basically, when the time came for them to organize themselves against these developments, they relied on the experience and the knowledge from their grandparents' generations and so on. So Penelope, how about in the case of Bolivia? Do you know anything about this sort of quote-unquote tradition of resistance and knowledge, sharing of knowledge before the 90s and so on?
I think there's a lot that I don't know, but I think it's important to say indigenous people have always resisted colonialism, including under formal Spanish colonialism, and then under the kind of post-colonial state with its forms of internal colonialism. There's a Bolivian indigenous scholar, Aymara scholar, Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui, who has a book called Oprimidos pero no vencidos. We were oppressed but not defeated. And actually there have been important oral history projects in the Andes which have kind of tried to record some of these histories, longer histories of indigenous resistance. And I think there's maybe two dimensions. On the one hand, there's a long history of indigenous peoples in both the highlands and the lowlands, which have quite different histories of state formation, of kind of colonial dispossession. But in both cases, there are kind of long histories of indigenous people seeking to engage with the state and the law to claim rights to their lands. And some of those examples we can find recorded in archives through documents produced in different periods, particularly in the Andes, I would say. But then, aside from long engagements with the kind of colonial and post-colonial state, there are also just kind of oral traditions of knowledge transmission in communities, which the only way we have to access them is to speak to indigenous people today. And some of that knowledge, I guess, has been sometimes lost through processes of kind of dispossession, displacement. But, Guarani people who I've spoke to, actually my first project, which was my PhD and became my first book, was the story of the Itikawasu territorial claim, which is where some of these people came from. And talking about kind of the origins of the struggle for territory there, people would talk about the world that their grandparents inhabited as a world kind of without borders, the practices their grandparents would have of hunting, of collecting honey, not consuming sugar, how kind of healthy their grandparents were. And there are these kind of memories of transmitted through oral history of what Guarani territory is, and the kind of what the Guarani call nyandereko, which is kind of our way of being. But of course, indigenous people themselves are the people to kind of answer that question about. But I think that transmission of oral knowledge is in itself a form of resistance and a form of kind of endurance, which continued even through these really difficult periods of history, like the debt peonage system in the Chaco.
It's very interesting. As the two of you were answering, I started thinking about when I was doing my fieldwork for my PhD in the early 2000s. One of the things that I found is that, well, now I teach a course on oral history methodology. One of the things I tell students is like, don't make the interviews too long, My interviews were super long. And so basically, don't do what... But then I remember that actually many of the elder men and women that I spoke to were in a way sort of like keen to speak to me, because one of the things that they say is that, well, nobody's interested anymore in speaking to us. I think the 90s, again, is a moment in which like many of the young people started to migrate from the rural areas to the urban areas and so on. And in our case, I think that sort of interrupted that sort of knowledge, transmission of knowledge. But just a final point before we open up the discussion with everybody here, indigeneity. And I think is one of the things that I've been sort of like addressing through my readings, through my discussions in class with my students, is the change in meaning of indigeneity throughout time. But what I think your film shows is also how dynamic, how fluid it is, what it means to be indigenous, right? And I think that is very interesting because you see how normally this kind of like state-sponsor legislation tends to sort of try to fix what indigeneity means and also fix the relationship of indigenous peoples to the land, to a particular space, right? But in your film, what we see is that actually this is a different indigenous community, and different in inverted commas, because it is two groups of indigenous people creating one community. So I like to see what you can tell us a little bit more about this kind of like fluid and dynamic meaning of indigeneity and how people are sort of recreating its meaning. And then I will invite Gloria also from the perspective of now being displaced or migrated outside, not just your community, but also your country, how that meaning may also change and be recreated in spaces like here. Yeah, Penelope.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really important question. I think it's very easy when we see struggles, by an indigenous organization for a territory, which is their indigenous territory, to kind of take for granted both the boundaries of that identity and the boundaries of that territory. And I think because my first project was the Guarani territory of Itikawasu, it was a kind of process of, demystifying that those, or seeing how those boundaries were created and actually also the artificial nature of those boundaries was something that I had to kind of gradually unravel through my research. And I would say making this film with Urukurenda has been another stage in my own kind of, it's deepened my own reflections, because these are people who were left out of that process of recognition that happened in the 1990s. Some people who know a bit about Bolivia might be quite kind of surprised to see this film, because Bolivia is a country that's associated with indigenous rights, a progressive constitution, many indigenous peoples who have kind of long struggles for territory and self-determination, now a constitution that recognizes recognizes Bolivia as a plurinational state with indigenous rights to territorial autonomy. All of this stuff has happened, but there are people who have actually been kind of not included in that because either they've moved or those processes didn't reach them. And in a way, by focusing on this group, I think we see a different construction of indigeneity. Here we see people who have migrated, some of them Guarani, migrating from the Chaco, but other people Quechua, all of them escaping forms of kind of exploitative labor relations in the countryside, and they have come together, they've formed solidarities, and we see Dino talking about how if there's will to join together in a collective, then there's no problem. So it's a kind of very non-exclusionary idea of indigeneity, and one that can accommodate difference. We also see Quechua people speaking Guarani in this film, and I think this really contrasts with the way that indigeneity is often constructed by the state, and in a way the kind of conditionalities on membership often become an instrument for not recognizing indigenous people. But I think that question of mobility is also really illuminating, particularly the way Dino talks about really powerfully about, as Guarani, we have no borders. We have no borders. We can make our community wherever we want within our territory. We can have membership to more than one community. And this really challenges the logics of the state, the kind of modern logic of territory, which is all about fixing boundaries. And actually, it is very much at odds with what processes of indigenous territorial recognition often look like. So they seem progressive. They are trying to, address claims of indigenous people, but they end up producing those boundaries of identity and territory, which are really quite at odds with this more fluid, more relational, and kind of understanding of territory.
Gloria, Cuecatecos, sin fronteras también, que la experiencia del indigenismo, entonces, a través de la movilidad, primero tú emigras a México DF, y luego ya vienes aquí a los Estados Unidos, y cómo esta identidad indígena cambia o fluye durante estos diferentes movimientos.
Bueno, hay una cosa que tenemos que entender, que la movilidad no es solo la migración, porque a veces se confunde mucho eso, y también creo que casi nunca nadie habla de la movilidad interna o de la migración. Siempre cuando hablan de migración es como, vine de México, crucé la frontera y vine a Estados Unidos, y la gente siempre se queda con esa idea. Y yo creo que en ese sentido, si conectamos un poquito lo que dice el documental, es que muestra esa movilidad no solamente como algo, como una decisión individual o económica, sino también, ¿cómo se dice?, esta movilidad surge por estas cuestiones estructurales de desplazamiento, de falta de oportunidades, y si lo conectamos con lo que pasa entre México y Estados Unidos, pues la migración para nosotros no es una elección, en la mayoría de las veces es una necesidad. Y volvemos al caso de Bolivia, no es un fenómeno aislado. Esto, decía yo al principio, es un patrón más amplio que sucede en casi toda Latinoamérica. Entonces, la movilidad indígena está vinculada a estas desigualdades que nos tocan también cuando llegamos aquí a Estados Unidos. Algo que me gustaría agregar también, una cosa que me llamó mucho la atención, es como en el documental, bueno, las personas guaraní, se me va el nombre, Urukurenda, cómo tienen esta claridad de su identidad y de exigir al Estado el reconocimiento. Y me gustaría conectarlo nuevamente con México, ¿no? Aunque las comunidades indígenas son reconocidas ante el Estado, cuando pedimos justicia, ahí se acaba el reconocimiento. Y eso es lo que le pasó a ellos cuando les dan el documento y luego se los vuelven a quitar, ¿no? Entonces, yo creo que todo está profundamente conectado, desde Bolivia hasta México y hasta toda parte de América Latina.
Yeah. You want to add something? Yeah.
Sobre todo cuando hay recursos estratégicos en su territorio. That non-recognition in this case was very much informed by, and I'm not sure if this is clear from the film, but in Bolivia, the right to prior consultation is associated with indigenous legal personhood. And so this becomes an incentive for non-recognition in the kind of context where there are really strategic resources at stake.
Bueno, en ese sentido, cuando ellos hablan de la consulta indígena, como dice ella, solo está como dentro del marco legal, pero en realidad no se aplica ni en Bolivia ni en ninguna parte, ¿no? Por eso es que ahora hay tantos proyectos concesionados y casi todos nuestros territorios están concesionados a empresas transnacionales.
Yeah.
I mean, I think what's interesting is that indigenous people haven't given up on legal recognition, but I think it's at these extractive frontiers that we really see the limits of the law and legal recognition, because it's one thing to have, as you said, in the Constitution or lots of laws, but actually in practice in these spaces, these things are not applied.
Por eso creo que valdría la pena que reflexionemos cuando se habla del territorio, hasta dónde nosotros como pueblos originarios o comunidades indígenas tenemos derecho al territorio, porque también se confunde mucho cuando dicen el territorio. No solo es la propiedad, el territorio es algo más profundo, como la historia, la identidad. Entonces la gente siempre confunde eso como el territorio y la propiedad, y no es solamente eso, va mucho más allá.
Yeah, thank you. I think, yeah. Sorry. I think it's time now. We can should maybe take some questions, comments from the audience. Anybody here who wants to maybe add something to what we've been discussing?
First, I want to thank you for my name is Leonor, and I have a question for Penelope. In your research and your work, did you have any experience in the region of the Chaco in Argentina?
Well, thanks for the question. The short answer is no, not directly. I haven't done any research myself in the Chaco region of Argentina, but actually it's been part of my research in the sense that there's been a lot of historic Guarani migration from the south of Bolivia to the north of Argentina. And actually in Guarani, Argentina is called Vaporenda, which means workplace. So there's a history of Guarani going to work on, I think, sugarcane plantations, but also there was a war between Bolivia and Paraguay in the 1930s, the Chaco War, which caused a huge amount of displacement of Guarani people. And there are various other indigenous peoples also in the Chaco, both in the Bolivian side and in Argentina. So, even this is another context of migration, is long histories of kind of seasonal or, sometimes several years of migration, where Guarani will go to another part of the Chaco to work and will come back to their communities. They sometimes have kind of kin or networks the other side of the border, but it's not something I've done much research on. I mean, my understanding is that the kind of framework of indigenous rights to territory in Argentina is a lot weaker actually than Bolivia in terms of the ability to claim collective rights to territory. And I know there's also the various similar problems: extractivism, the expansion of kind of agro-industrial kind of frontier, climate change, desertification, many environmental pressures on communities also in the north of Argentina.
Much more extreme now, especially, also going all the way south with the Mapuche in Patagonia, and with the Mapuche and all these companies also coming from everywhere.
Yeah,
and the issue with also the glaciares in Patagonia, but especially the Mapuche communities. They're just quite tragic now. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Antonio. I'm a PhD student here in Spanish and Portuguese, working with indigenous authorship and intellectual histories in Brazil. Can you hear me? I can speak louder. I think I can do that. One of the issues that I keep coming across in my research has been the one of recognition. And I was wondering, Penelope, if you could speak more to what are the parameters and who is it that I got from the letters, for example, that it's the governor who decides who is indigenous, what communities are campesinas and which ones are indigenous. In the US and Canada, which are contexts I'm more familiar with, we speak a lot of blood quantum, of the doors, rows, having your names and ancestries mapped out to specific community members who have been registered historically. I understand that in this case, we're speaking of whether this community and other individuals are recognized as indigenous. And on what grounds are those decisions made? Is it just purely continuous presence and stewardship in the territory? Does it go to blood and ancestry at any point? What is being taken into account, and who is it that decide? Is the state the governor? Is it the community? Is it the court?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. So, who can recognize indigenous personhood in Bolivia, and on what grounds, basically? And you've pointed to something quite interesting and contradictory, because actually in Bolivia it's not about blood quantums. You don't have to provide evidence. Indigenous identity is a question of self-identification, at least as far as things like the census go, right? But there's a kind of bureaucratic caveat here, which is that legal personhood, which is something that various kind of entities and organizations need to have in order to make claims before the law, has always historically been granted by the departmental government. So it's kind of departments are I don't know what to say, that like maybe the equivalent to states in a kind of US context. And so they have their own kind of, local ruling party, which may not be the same as the kind of national ruling party. And this has been very problematic for indigenous communities, including Guarani communities who are within a recognized TCO territory. Some of those indigenous communities, paradoxically, don't have indigenous legal personhood, because there's been a history in this region, which is a region marked by, as I've said, debt peonage and very kind of colonial power relations within the regional context. There's been a history of basically the kind of departmental governor granting legal personhood as comunidades campesinas wherever possible. So this is not only Urukurenda, there are actually many Guarani communities who are in a similar boat in terms of their legal personhood being wrong according to them. Of course, there are also mixed communities who have people who are both, Guarani and non-Guarani. So there's that problem of legal personhood, and the lack of a legal personhood then, as you saw in the film, leading to a lack of state investment, potentially denial of certain kinds of rights. But indigenous communities also feel very strongly that this is against the constitution and that the departmental governor should not have the ability to deny them their indigenous personhood. So the kind of legal complaints they've presented will refer to the Bolivian constitution and say, in Bolivia, indigenous people are the people who should decide what their own identity is. And so, this is discrimination, this is unconstitutional. So this is a kind of struggle in a way between different layers of the state, different kind of bureaucratic processes. And you can see how, although these processes are often, in the interests of powerful actors rather than indigenous people engage with those legal struggles in very creative ways and try to kind of point out those contradictions.
Hola, también soy del Departamento de Español y Portugués. Yo soy Grecia y mi pregunta es para Tadii y para Penélope, como quieran contestarla. Es una pregunta más o menos amplia que puede tener como dos lados. Me pregunto todavía sobre, como decían hace rato, estas movilidades, estos movimientos de las personas dentro de sus territorios, que pueden ser muy amplios, y cómo se adscriben a una comunidad o a otra. Y como decía Tadii, esta claridad que tienen sobre su identidad para decir que son parte de estas múltiples comunidades y al mismo tiempo, una cosa. Pero luego también, ¿qué hace eso? ¿Qué es lo que posibilita para estas personas como parte de un proyecto político? Identificarse como esas personas en movilidad. Y por el otro lado, ¿qué es lo que hace el desplazamiento forzado también? Pienso mucho en lo que decía sobre cómo tu comunidad, Tadii, ya había sido comprada, ¿no? A pesar de que estaban ahí dentro del territorio, y cómo ustedes que estaban fuera veían esto como con otra perspectiva. ¿Qué es lo que estar en condiciones de desplazamiento forzado, porque justo no siempre se escoge como irse fuera del territorio, qué es lo que activa más que posibilita? Porque, pienso mucho en estas otras relaciones, en esta partida fracturada o violenta, quizás, y en cómo eso transforma nuestras visiones, nuestros proyectos políticos, cómo transforma las comunidades que hacemos y los planes de esas mismas nuevas comunidades. ¿Sí tiene sentido?
Sí. Bueno, voy a conectar un poquito desde la movilidad de nosotros. Por ejemplo, cuando llegamos aquí a Estados Unidos, sucede mucho lo que sucede en estas comunidades en Bolivia, porque aquí muchos de nosotros llegamos y a veces al principio es difícil porque uno está un poco aislado, no sabe cómo conectar. En mi caso, pues se me ha dado más tal vez por el trabajo que hago en las comunidades, pero cuando llegamos aquí es seguir aprendiendo entre nosotros, volver a conectar, no importa si somos mexicanos, si somos ecuatorianos. Entonces, eso hace que nosotros aquí formemos nuevas comunidades con un solo objetivo, el reconocimiento. Desafortunadamente, esa invisibilidad de donde venimos nos viene persiguiendo hasta acá, porque aquí, aunque trabajamos como comunidades indígenas de diferentes países, seguimos sufriendo la invisibilidad por parte de este sistema tan estructurado que hay aquí en Estados Unidos. Entonces, creo que esa parte, cuando ellos se juntan, pues también conecta mucho con nosotros acá. No sé si respondí la pregunta o...
Sí, gracias por la pregunta. Creo que por un lado, la gente en el documental, como don Dino Ortiz, afirman que el movimiento dentro de su territorio es algo muy normal, siempre ha pasado, es parte de la forma de ser guaraní y que no debería ser una razón para cuestionar su identidad guaraní, más bien ser guaraní es poder viajar dentro de su territorio. Pero claro que vemos también que las razones por estos movimientos tienen que ver también con las condiciones materiales de vida, la búsqueda de tierra en un contexto de desplazamiento, también la necesidad de escapar de relaciones de explotación. Y entonces hay también factores que tienen que ver con el poder colonial, capitalista, que hacen necesario estos movimientos. Y estos movimientos también en el contexto de un Estado y una sociedad agraria que no quiere reconocer la presencia indígena, llegan a ser también un pretexto de desconocimiento. Entonces yo creo que defender la movilidad como parte de la territorialidad indígena es un acto político muy necesario, sin olvidar que también hay causas de desplazamiento que son parte del contexto de estos movimientos. Entonces yo creo que es como tiene su lado tal vez positivo y negativo, ¿no? Hay que ver las dos cosas a la vez. I'm not sure if I should translate.
Yeah, maybe a summary. Better you than
Yeah, I'll try and be really brief. So I was just saying that we see in the film that people really try to defend mobility as part of indigenous people's practices and part of their territoriality, and in no way a kind of reason to deny that identity. But we also see that the reasons why people move have to do with labor exploitation, displacement, debt peonage. So there are a whole series of factors which also are causing people to leave their territories, and actually also cause people to leave Urukurenda, and that those displacements very unfairly then become a pretext for non-recognition. So it's kind of a double bind for indigenous peoples in that sense, in terms of those ideas of recognition that require kind of continuous territorial occupation.
Thank you. I don't know if we have any other question, a final one, maybe we have or comment.
Thank you. My name is Vanessa. I'm visiting from California. I'm a fourth grade teacher there, and my daughter goes to school here at NYU. And I'm so excited that I happened to come today and view this. It was a beautiful film, and I thank you both, all three of you, for presenting. It reminded me a lot of migrant workers in California, because they do so much. We have such a strong agrarian population there, provide so much of the produce for the nation, and they're invisible and they're not treated fairly. And I looked at how the people that you were interviewing were speaking. I mean, as an educator, I'm like, wow, their language, their vocabulary is beautiful. And I loved how you inserted that part where he said, oh, I had to get my niece and nephew to read it. I just assumed they were literate. And I think we all assume that. And I just thought they're very intelligent. And I feel like maybe they are looked down upon because they're not educated. But I thought, oh my gosh, they have so much to educate us about. And I just thank you so much for bringing this to light, because it was really beautiful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for that comment. And I mean, we're actually just talking about this yesterday. This is something I'm continuously really humbled by in my work in the Chaco is how articulate and also how incisive and thoughtful people are in analysing their own realities and telling their own stories. I mean, they're amazing. And as you said, it really challenges the kind of assumptions that people who are not, haven't had the privilege of formal education, maybe are not literate, that this somehow means that they are ignorant. And we were talking yesterday about how the people who often understand these complex, multi-layered, multi-sited kind of processes, which we as academics are trying to get our heads around, the people who often understand them with the most clarity are people who are actually living the sharp end of those processes and have the historical memory also of their ancestors having struggled against kind of colonial power. And to me, this is why, even with my quite limited film skills as a filmmaker, I feel compelled to try to continue this type of method, because for me, ordinary people are the most powerful kind of narrators of their own stories. So I'm glad that you share that sense.
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting because just yesterday, as Penelope mentioned, we were talking about it in relation to a similar case of extractivist industries in Brazil, and how the community, they organized themselves, they wrote these documents and so on, and the minister said, like, well, there's no way you've written this, like somebody is helping you out to do these things. And I guess it's because of how we acquire knowledge. We tend to assume that is the only way in which like knowledge is acquired, right? So it's like, as we talk about the sharing of knowledge, but it's also sharing of knowledge is benefiting not just from whatever is happening at the time, but also from whatever happened before, right? And there's always, and I think that you mentioned that, I think that that community that went to speak to the ones in the Ithaca about what is it that had happened. They're already thinking about the future. So it's almost like there is that connection. Is the present is here. We know about the past, but we need to talk to a different community to see what it is that is going to happen to us, right? So I mean, it is as I said, I think it's a humbling experience to come face to face with how that knowledge, how they apply that knowledge and how it's shared and so on, and you then realize that, you know, that, well, okay, we benefit from whatever education we have obtained, but obviously there are many other ways in which like people become educated, especially when their survival is at stake, right? In many ways. Gloria, I don't know if you want to add, si quieres añadir algo.
No, I
Okay.
Sí,
All
gracias.
right. Thank you so much. I just like a final thought I like to perhaps share is this idea of indigeneity and the concept itself or identifying one as an indigenous person, because I think it is very radical in many ways, and radical in the sense that it is contesting all kinds of situations of what I've been discussing with my students as unacceptable power, right? That is expressed in many different ways. And I think as a historian, I think of this because this part of the world is where many of these things started, right? How we think today about indigenous has to do with what began here like over 500 years ago. But also, if we think about nation states in many ways emerged from this kind of imperial expansions that led to the development of nation states in Europe and then elsewhere and so on. And then at the same time, we see proto-capitalism also developing through the forms of exploitation of indigenous peoples and then peoples of African people and African descent, also in the Americas. So that 500 years later, perhaps when we are in a way devoid of kind of like radical thoughts and alternatives to counter sometimes the abuses of nation states against their citizens, or sometimes the abuses of large corporations against their citizens, I think this being indigenous, it is more useful today than ever in many ways. It is a very valid way of countering these abuses. And in some ways, I think perhaps this way in which like maybe those who don't consider themselves indigenous in many ways we have to learn more and embrace these kinds of struggles, because in many ways they don't just speak to struggles sometimes of just indigenous peoples, speak to struggles that we haven't spoken about, but I mean these comunidades, the campesinos and all the disadvantaged communities, and even people who, you know, like and we see examples, by the way, in terms of like even middle classes in wealthy countries today see sometimes disadvantage against like you know, some of the developments taking place. So I think there is plenty to learn about these historical experiences, but also about the struggles today happening within indigenous communities. So for that, I'm grateful that to Espacio de Culturas that I had the opportunity to come here, and of course I'm grateful to Gloria and Penelope for sharing this final public event with me. Thank you so much.
Bueno, sí quiero decir algo, que los indígenas no somos los pobrecitos, because everywhere we go, oh, pobrecita. We're not the pobrecitos. We have the power, and we organize or wherever we are, because the state always looking at us like como piezas de museo. So we are not. We are human beings.
A mic drop. All right, thank you. Thank you.